The night they locked me in a cell, my federal badge sat in a plastic evidence bag on the booking officer's desk, just a few feet away, clearly visible through the scratched plexiglass divider. Officer Caldwell had held it up like it was some kind of novelty item, turning it over under the fluorescent light. He squinted at the gold Deputy Marshal star, the way a man squints at a check he suspects will bounce, then tossed it into the evidence tray with a small, indifferent clatter. "We'll sort it out in the morning," he said. He did not look at me when he spoke. By morning, he would no longer have a job to return to. Neither would 14 of his colleagues. But none of that existed yet. There was only the orange-lit cell, the sharp chemical smell of industrial cleaner, and the sound of my own breathing in the darkness. My name is Malik Reynolds. That night, I was a 12-year Deputy U.S. Marshal with the Eastern Seaboard District. I had walked out of the Federal Law Enforcement Training Centers in Glencoe at 29 years old, with a badge that felt heavier than I expected, and a sense of purpose that felt exactly right. In 12 years, I had transported high-value federal fugitives across 6 states in the dead of night. I had stood inside federal courtrooms where the defendants had more legal resources than most small municipalities. I had coordinated with FBI tactical units, DEA, Secret Service, and every variation of alphabet agency the federal government had ever thought to create. I knew federal statute the way a pianist knows a keyboard, not by reading it, but by feel, by the specific weight of each key and what breaks when you hit the wrong one too hard. I had never been on the wrong side of a cell door in my life. None of that mattered that night, in the parking lot of a Marriott in Belleville, Georgia. I had driven down from Atlanta that afternoon for what should have been the most routine assignment on my calendar. A federal witness named Lamar Holt had been swept up on an unrelated local warrant and was sitting in Belleville County Jail. My office had issued a federal detainer. My job was simple. Arrive the following morning, complete the handoff paperwork with the county's Marshal liaison, and transport Holt back to Atlanta by noon. I had done this exact job, different city, different name, close to 200 times. I checked into the Marriott in the afternoon, confirmed the morning handoff over the phone, changed out of my travel clothes, and walked across the 4-lane boulevard to a barbecue place I had spotted from the highway. Pulled pork, sweet tea, a slice of peach cobbler I did not need, but ordered anyway. The kind of meal that sits clean in your memory afterward, not because of its own quality, but because of what came after it. The parking lot was nearly empty when I came back. The Georgia night was warm and thick, the kind of warm that settles into your clothes and stays there. Crickets in the tree line at the edge of the lot, orange glow from the overhead lights. My gym bag was over one shoulder, my room key in my right hand. I was 20 feet from the hotel entrance, thinking about the shower I was going to take and the nothing I was going to watch on my laptop before going to sleep, when the cruiser came in fast with no lights and angled itself directly across my path. 2 officers got out. The taller one had his hand resting near his holster before he had even fully straightened up. I stopped. I kept my hands visible and my body completely still. I had been practicing this stillness since I was a teenager in Atlanta. The deliberate calm, the performance of non-threat that black men learn not from any official training manual, but from the accumulated survival knowledge passed down like an inheritance nobody ever asked to receive. "Hey," the tall one said. His name, I would learn later, was Langford. It was not a greeting. It was a command. "Evening," I said. "Where are you coming from?" "Dinner," I said, nodding toward the restaurant across the street. "I'm a guest at the hotel here, just coming back." Langford looked at the restaurant, then back at me. The second officer, Briggs, 18 months on the job and 26 years old, was already moving to flank me. Something in the air shifted the way it does before weather arrives. A pressure change, subtle and definitive. "Can I see some ID?" Briggs said. "I'm going to reach into my jacket slowly," I said. Clear, even. The standard verbal protocol when you are armed and need to communicate it before anyone makes a decision they cannot walk back. "I need to let you both know I am a federal law enforcement officer, and I am carrying a service weapon." That should have ended it. It always had before. "Hands!" Langford barked. And then both of them were on me at once, fast, and I was pressed against the hood of the cruiser before I had time to speak again. The metal felt cold and hard against my cheek. One arm wrenched up behind my back, the full weight of a man's hand driving between my shoulder blades. My gym bag hit the asphalt. My jacket was yanked open. My badge holder spilled out. The gold Deputy Marshal star and the federal ID card, both of them landing face up on the asphalt under the parking lot lights, unmistakable, right there. "I am a United States Marshal," I said into the metal of the hood. Each word came out pressed flat. "That badge on the ground is federal law enforcement identification. You need to call your supervisor right now." I paused. I felt one of them crouch, heard the badge picked up, heard fingers on the laminated ID. "Could be fake," Briggs said. His voice had the specific quality of someone who has already made a decision and is now producing words to fit around it. 4 words, spoken by a 26-year-old officer in a strip mall parking lot in South Georgia. Those 4 words would eventually cost the city of Belleville $8,200,000. They would end 15 law enforcement careers. They would be read aloud in a congressional subcommittee hearing and quoted in 3 separate federal court filings. But none of that existed yet. What existed was the cold hood against my face, the plastic zip tie going around my wrists, and the sound of my federal credentials being dropped into an evidence bag with a noise like something being sealed away. The dashboard clock showed the late hour when they loaded me into the back of the cruiser. I watched it through the divider as they pulled out of the parking lot, and I committed the time to memory the way my training had always taught me. Anchor every detail, because you may need to reconstruct it later in a room where someone is asking questions you cannot afford to answer wrong. I asked to speak to a supervisor 3 times on the drive over. Langford turned up the radio. Briggs was telling him something about a game, a score, a quarter that had gone the wrong way. The streetlights of Belleville passed in slow orange intervals through the window, and I sat with my hands behind my back and let the details accumulate. The route we took, the turns, the name of the detention center as it appeared on the building in block letters when we pulled into the lot, Belleville Municipal. The time we arrived was late in the evening. Caldwell took my phone at booking. He took my watch. He took the backup ID in my wallet and the secondary Marshal's credential I kept in a separate billfold in my inside jacket pocket. 4 separate pieces of federal law enforcement identification, and he logged every one of them as unverified. I asked to make a phone call. He told me I could do that in the morning. I asked again, keeping my voice level, keeping my hands flat on the processing counter. He walked to the far end of the desk and began typing. I asked a 3rd time, and he looked up, finally, slowly, and said, with the patient tone of a man explaining something to a child, "You'll get your call in the morning." I did not get my call that night. The cell smelled of bleach, and beneath it, something older and harder to name. The specific atmosphere of a room that has held people against their will night after night until the walls absorb it into the paint. I sat on the metal bench and pressed my back against the cinder block and made myself breathe slowly and all the way down. There was a crack in the paint above the door, a long diagonal line that someone had traced with a fingernail over and over until the layer beneath the white showed through in a pale gray groove. I stared at that crack for a long time. I thought about my mother. She had worked 30 years as an ER nurse at Grady Hospital in Atlanta, double shifts, overnight holiday rotations, the full, relentless weight of that job, so that her son could have a career that stood for something real and lasting. I thought about her face and felt something constrict in my chest that I would not let become grief. I thought about my supervisor, Vince Kowalski, who was going to have a very interesting morning. I thought about 12 years of service, the transport runs, the court escorts, the 3 times I had been shot at, and the once I had actually been hit. The years of doing the job exactly as it was designed to be done. Correctly and quietly, and without complaint. And I felt something in me go still. Not the still of fear, the still of a man who has begun to do arithmetic, slowly and carefully, in his head. I sat in that cell for hours on end. When they returned my phone the following morning, the screen lit up with 11 missed calls. 7 were from Vince Kowalski. 2 were from my office. 1 was from a number I did not recognize, which turned out, when I called it back from the parking lot while Officer Caldwell watched me from behind the glass, with an expression that was already beginning to understand it had made a mistake, to be the regional director of the Department of Justice's Civil Rights Division, who had been reached by Kowalski late the night before and had spent the night making calls of his own. The first call I made myself was to attorney Lena Washington. Lena had been my attorney for 4 years. She was 53, a former federal prosecutor, with a practice built almost entirely around dismantling exactly these kinds of situations. Brick by brick, layer by layer, with the methodical patience of someone who has been doing this long enough to stop being angry and start being surgical. She picked up on the second ring, despite it being early morning. "Malik!" Her voice was already awake, already focused, like she had been waiting for this call. "Tell me everything. Don't skip a single thing." I stood in the parking lot of the Belleville Municipal Detention Center, in the same clothes I had been arrested in. The morning sun was already starting its work on the asphalt, and I told her everything. I did not skip a single thing. Lena arrived in Belleville shortly after. I had not expected her to drive down herself. That was a 4-hour trip from Atlanta. But Lena had not asked my opinion on the logistics. She pulled into the detention center parking lot in a silver Volvo, stepped out in a charcoal blazer and flat shoes, and walked toward me, carrying a leather case that she held at her side like a weapon she had not yet decided to draw. She looked at my clothes, at the crease in my jaw where the hood of the cruiser had left a mark that was still faintly visible, and her expression did not change at all, which told me everything. "Did they touch your service weapon?" was the first thing she said. "Logged it as evidence. It is still inside. They discharged you, disarmed you, processed you, and held you overnight while 4 pieces of federal law enforcement identification sat in their property room." She said it quietly, not as a question, but as a sentence being assembled for a courtroom. And none of them made a single call to verify. Not a single call. She looked at the building. The expression she wore was the one I had seen her put on before she walked into depositions, a kind of focused stillness, the way a surgeon looks before the first incision. "Good," she said. "And then? We are going in." She retrieved my badge, my weapon, my watch, my phone, and my secondary credentials from a property officer named Garrett, who had the look of a man watching a natural disaster approach from a distance he could no longer trust. He signed every transfer form she placed in front of him in silence. When we walked back out into the parking lot, Lena handed me my badge holder, and I clipped it to my belt, and stood there for a moment in the morning sun, feeling the specific weight of it settle against my hip, and thought about the long hours during which it had been just a few feet away from me behind a scratched plexiglass window. "Where are we?" I said. "I spoke with Victor Lang from the DOJ Civil Rights Division early this morning," she said, opening the Volvo's trunk and setting her case inside. "He was already in motion. What you do not know yet, because you were in a cell when it happened, is that your supervisor ran your badge number through federal system verification late the night before and got a direct confirmation back in 4 minutes. 4 minutes, Malik. Your credentials are real-time verifiable through a federal database that any law enforcement officer in this country can access from a squad car laptop. They had the tools. They chose not to use them." I stood with that for a moment. The morning air smelled like cut grass and diesel from the road. "Someone made a decision," I said. "Several someones made several decisions," Lena said. "And I am going to find every single one of them." What I did not know yet, what Lena would uncover in the weeks that followed, layer by careful layer, like peeling paint off a wall to find the rot underneath, was that that night had not been a simple failure of protocol. It had been the visible surface of something that went deeper and older. Something that had been accumulating in the Belleville Municipal Police Department for years and had never been properly named until the night they put a federal marshal in a cell and gave me hours on end to decide what I was going to do about it. The first layer was Langford. His record, which Lena obtained through discovery before the city's attorneys had time to fully appreciate what was coming, showed 7 prior complaints in 4 years on the force. 3 for excessive force, 2 for unlawful detention, 1 for failure to follow escalation protocol, and 1 filed by a black physician who had been stopped and detained in a hospital parking lot while wearing his scrubs and his ID badge around his neck. That complaint had been reviewed, filed, and closed with a notation of insufficient evidence to proceed. The officer who reviewed it had been Langford's direct supervisor, a lieutenant named Victor Hale, who had spent 19 years in the department and regarded complaints the way a river regards a stone, something to be diverted around, smoothed over, and eventually forgotten. The second layer was Briggs, 18 months on the job, and his personnel file contained something that his supervisors had apparently found unremarkable: a field training evaluation from month 6 that noted, in the measured language of bureaucratic euphemism, that Officer Briggs had demonstrated inconsistency in the application of de-escalation protocols when interacting with individuals of diverse backgrounds. The training officer who wrote that evaluation had recommended mandatory remedial training. The recommendation had been approved. The training had never been scheduled. The third layer, and this was the one that changed the temperature of everything, was the dashboard camera. Both officers' vehicles were equipped with dash cameras. Langford's had malfunctioned, or so the initial report stated. Briggs's footage existed, but had not been preserved properly, and would not be available for review. The department's Internal Affairs Office reported in a memo a few days after my arrest, one day after Lena had formally requested all video evidence in a certified letter sent to the department's legal counsel, the chief of police, and the city attorney simultaneously. Lena called me on a Tuesday night a few weeks later. I was sitting at my kitchen table in Atlanta with a cup of coffee that had gone cold while I stared at nothing in particular, which had become a habit I did not love, but had not yet managed to stop. "They erased Briggs's dashcam footage," she said. The coffee cup was cold and smooth in my hand. Outside the kitchen window, the city was doing its nighttime business in the amber dark. "When?" I said. "Based on the metadata the tech forensics team recovered from the device, the footage was overwritten the day after you were released, the day before my preservation letter arrived." Something shifted in my chest. Not surprise, because some part of me had expected this, but a colder and more useful feeling. The feeling of a door closing and another one opening. "Can they prove it was deliberate?" I said. They can prove the overwrite was manual, not automatic. The department's own policy requires dashcam footage to be preserved for a minimum of 90 days. Someone went into that system and deleted it by hand. A pause. And the server logs show the login credentials belong to Lieutenant Victor Hale. I set the coffee cup down very carefully on the table and looked at it. Lena, I know. That is obstruction. Yes, she said, with the clean, precise satisfaction of someone who has just placed the final piece of an argument. It is. The next 72 hours were the closest thing to a war room I had ever run outside of an actual federal operation. Lena worked from her conference table in Atlanta with 3 associates and a forensic IT specialist. Supervisor Vince Kowalski had by this point formally escalated the matter to the U.S. Marshal Service's Office of Internal Affairs and the Department of Justice's Office of Professional Responsibility, both of which had opened independent investigations. The DOJ Civil Rights Division had assigned 2 attorneys to the case. There were calls I was not on, meetings I was not in, conversations happening in federal buildings in Washington that would eventually produce consequences I could only partially imagine from where I sat. What I could do, and what I did, was build the timeline. I sat at my kitchen table every night that week with a legal pad and a pen, and I wrote down everything I remembered from that night. Not in the traumatized, circling way that I had been going over it in my mind since that night. The obsessive replays, the what-ifs, the moments where a different choice might have changed the outcome, but in the clean, factual, sequential way my training had drilled into me for 12 years. Time, location, statement, action, witness. The stamp of the clock on the dashboard, the names I had heard, the words I had committed to memory, the moment the badge hit the asphalt, the 4-word sentence that had set everything in motion. I called my mother on the Thursday. She picked up before the second ring, the way she always does, like she had been waiting. Malik, her voice carried everything she was not going to say out loud. I am okay, Mom. Tell me. So I told her, the same way I had told Lena, but warmer, slower, with more room in it. She listened without interrupting, which cost her something. I could hear it. When I finished, the line was quiet for a moment. Baby, she said finally, are you sure you want to do this? Because when you pull a thread like this, you do not know what comes with it. I know exactly what comes with it, I said. That is why I am pulling it. Another silence. Then she said, your father would have too. She hung up before I could answer. I sat with that in the kitchen for a long time. The city outside the window, the cold coffee, the legal pad, the pen. The formal federal complaint was filed a few weeks after my arrest. 41 pages. It named officers Langford and Briggs for unlawful arrest, use of excessive force, and violation of federal civil rights under 42 U.S.C. Section 1983. It named Lieutenant Victor Hale for obstruction of justice and deliberate destruction of evidence. It named the Belleville Municipal Police Department for systemic failure to supervise, failure to train, and a documented pattern of discriminatory enforcement against Black residents and visitors. It named the city of Belleville for institutional negligence in permitting the pattern to persist across multiple administrations. The complaint included the 7 prior complaints against Langford, the unscheduled remedial training that never happened for Briggs, the server logs showing the manual deletion of dashcam footage, and a supplementary appendix that Lena's team had compiled from public records requests. 15 years of use-of-force reports from the Belleville Department broken down by race of the individual stopped. The numbers were not subtle. The city attorney reviewed the complaint on a Friday afternoon. I know this because Lena's office received a call at the end of that same day. She told me later that she had been putting on her coat to leave when her phone rang. The city attorney, a man named Leonard Ballard, who had held the position for 11 years and who sounded, according to Lena, like a man who had just been handed a bill he had not budgeted for, said he needed to speak with her about a potential path toward resolution. "How large is the path?" Lena asked him. He named a number. Lena told him to add a 0. He said that was impossible. She said she would see him in federal court in the spring. And then she put on her coat and went home. And Ballard spent the weekend calling the mayor. By the time we sat down at a conference table in Atlanta later that winter, the negotiations had been going on for weeks and had already swallowed one preliminary offer that Lena had declined without opening her laptop. Ballard was there. The mayor's chief of staff was there. 2 city council members sat along the wall, saying very little. Lena sat across from them with her associate and the 41-page complaint printed and bound in a black folder that she set on the table and did not open because she did not need to. She knew every page of it. So did they. $8,200,000, Lena said after Ballard had finished speaking. She said it the way you state a fact, not the way you make a request. Paid to Malik Reynolds, non-negotiable, and the structural reforms. The reforms were the part Ballard had been hoping to avoid. They were, in Lena's view, the point. The money was restitution. The reforms were the thing that might, if implemented fully and in good faith, mean that the next person who drove through Belleville with a federal badge would not spend the night in a cell, while a night officer filed their credentials under unverified. She set a second document on the table, 12 pages. Mandatory body camera policy with a 3-year retention requirement and tamper-evident logging. Mandatory de-escalation training certification for every officer, renewed annually. An independent civilian oversight board with actual authority to review complaints and compel documentation. A direct protocol for federal credential verification, which required any officer to run a badge number through the federal database within 10 minutes of a stop and to notify a supervisor immediately upon confirmation. The names Langford, Briggs, and Hale, and the 12 others implicated in the pattern identified in the complaint's appendix would be referred to the State Post Board for decertification review. Ballard looked at the document for a long time. 15 careers, he said quietly. It was not an objection. It was closer to accounting. They ended their own careers, Lena said, her voice absolutely level. That night, and on every prior occasion that this department was informed of a problem and chose to do nothing about it. My client gave those officers every opportunity to do the right thing. I believe he gave them 3 separate verbal statements of his federal status. He showed them credentials. He asked to speak to a supervisor. He asked for a phone call. He was denied at every turn. The question of careers is not one I have much sympathy for at this particular table. The room was very quiet. Through the window of the conference room, Atlanta glittered in the winter light, cold and silver and enormous. "We will need until later in the month," Ballard said finally. "You have until the 20th, Lena said. "I have a trial date in the new year. I will not move." They signed shortly afterward. $8,200,000. All 15 officers referred for decertification. 12 of them lost their certifications within months. 3, including Hale, faced additional criminal referrals. Hale was ultimately charged with obstruction and evidence tampering, pled to a reduced charge soon after, and received 18 months of supervised probation, a fine, and a permanent bar from law enforcement employment. Langford's prior complaints were reopened by the State Post Board. He was decertified in the following weeks. Briggs resigned before his review was completed and moved to a different state, which would not help him because decertification is federal database reportable and follows you wherever you go. I returned to full duty shortly after. My first assignment was a transport run from Savannah to Charleston. A 5-hour round trip through Georgia coastal country, highway and marsh and the particular pale winter light that sits on flat water at that time of year. Routine, quiet, unremarkable. Exactly what I needed. On the drive back up to Atlanta afterward, I stopped at the same barbecue place in Belleville. I do not know exactly why. Maybe to prove something to myself, or maybe to close something that had been left open. The pulled pork was exactly the same. I got the peach cobbler again. I sat in a corner booth and ate slowly and watched the Tuesday evening traffic on the 4-lane boulevard outside, ordinary and indifferent. And I thought about my mother's voice on the phone that night saying, "Your father would have too." And the way that sentence had landed in my chest and stayed there. My father had been a civil rights attorney in Atlanta for 31 years before he died. He had sat at tables like the one that winter and put documents in front of people who did not want to read them and waited with perfect stillness until they did. I paid the check and walked out to my car. The evening air was cold and clean, with the specific clarity of a Georgia winter that had not yet decided whether it wanted to be winter or spring. I sat in the driver's seat for a moment before starting the engine. My badge was on my hip where it belonged. The parking lot was lit the same orange as it had been that night, the same tree line at the edge, the same geometry of light and asphalt. Different night, different man. I drove back to Atlanta with both hands on the wheel and the radio off. And for the first time in the time since, the silence in the car felt like mine.